A billionaire tried to buy redemption with money until a waitress made him face something no one else dared, his own son's truth. The silence in Kingsley's, Manhattan's most elite dining room, didn't arrive gently. It slammed into the room the moment the soft notes of the live piano drifted across the clink of silverware, and a boy in metal leg braces began to rise from his chair. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery trembled as he stood, his legs shaky under the weight of steel supports, his eyes fixed on a single figure moving between tables. She wasn't the kind of person people noticed at Kingsley's. Diana Johnson, the only black waitress on staff, moved like someone trained to disappear. Efficient, precise, silent, but Lucas noticed her. And then, in one movement both innocent and seismic, he extended his hand. For a moment no one understood what was happening, then someone gasped. A fork clattered onto a plate, the pianist paused, the manager didn't. Mr. Thornton's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Sir, control your son. This is not a playground, and our staff are not entertainment." Heads turned, not just at the boy, but at the audacity. Richard Montgomery, one of the most powerful men in the country, sat frozen. This was the first time he had brought Lucas out in public since the accident 2 years ago. A mistake he now realized that he would not repeat. "Lucas," he said through clenched teeth, "sit down." But Lucas didn't move. His hand was still hanging there, small and shaking. Diana had paused, tray in hand, midway through delivering sparkling water to a corner table. Her eyes flicked, first to the manager, then to Richard, and finally to the boy. The room expected her to pretend it hadn't happened, to fade as always. She didn't. "Mr. Thornton," she said calmly, "my shift is over." She placed the tray down, removed her apron with deliberate grace, folded it, and set it aside. "I can't dance in an apron." And then, without waiting for permission from anyone, she turned to Lucas and smiled. "May I?" The boy nodded, eyes wide with something between hope and terror. He took a step. His brace scraped across the polished floor with an agonizing screech. Diana adjusted her own step, not to guide him, not to correct, but to match. She let him lead, not well, not gracefully, but entirely on his terms. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion. "She's getting fired tomorrow," she whispered. Richard Montgomery stood up, not out of support, but disbelief. His voice rose, not loud, but full of tightly wound fury. "What do you think you're doing?" Diana didn't flinch. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." It was 3 steps, that was all, but those 3 steps bent the atmosphere in the room like heat on glass. Lucas didn't smile, he concentrated. Because for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't being pushed, adjusted, or corrected. He wasn't being treated like something broken. He was dancing, he was leading. The pianist, without instruction, began to play again. Soft, hesitant, then fuller, something classical, something forgiving. The manager turned to Richard again. "Mr. Montgomery, I assure you she'll be disciplined. This will not happen again." But Richard didn't respond. He was staring at his son, at the stiffness in his gait, the defiant set of his chin. And then, for just a moment, the memory hit him like a ghost in the room. Elizabeth, his wife, Lucas's mother, twirling barefoot in their living room, holding Lucas's tiny hands and laughing. "It's not about perfection," she had said that day. "It's about connection." Diana guided Lucas gently back to his seat. She didn't curtsy, she didn't bow, but she looked him in the eye as if he were an equal. "Thank you for the dance," she said, voice soft but formal. As she turned to leave, Richard found himself speaking before he understood why. "Wait." His voice didn't sound like his own. "What's your full name?" She paused. "Diana Johnson, sir." He nodded slowly, memorizing it. "Diana Johnson." Then he reached into his coat and handed her a business card. "My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. The entire restaurant held its breath. She took the card with steady fingers, but her hand trembled just slightly. Lucas broke the silence. "Dad, why did you do that?" The question wasn't a child's whine, it was a challenge, a mirror, and Richard didn't have an answer. As Diana walked out the door, she glanced back once. Not with fear, not with regret, but with the kind of calm resolve that only someone who had already decided what mattered most could carry. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she had seen something in that boy's eyes, something she had seen before, something she would not ignore. The lobby of Montgomery Tower gleamed like the inside of a jewelry box. Glass walls, polished marble, soft lighting that seemed to hum with power. Diana Johnson stood in the center of it all in her best outfit, a navy skirt and a blouse that still carried the scent of lavender detergent. Her shoes, carefully shined but cracked near the soles, clicked softly against the floor as she approached the front desk. The receptionist didn't look up at first. When she finally did, her eyes moved over Diana with clinical efficiency. Name: Diana Johnson. I have a 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Montgomery. A pause, a call, then, 18th floor, Miss Winters will meet you. The elevator ride was silent, save for the soft hum and Diana's steady breathing. She held her purse close, not out of fear, but resolve. She had walked into courtrooms before, shelters, community boards, but this was different. This was enemy ground disguised as elegance. Miss Winters greeted her with the poise of a diplomat, hair pulled tight, suit tailored to precision. This way. They moved down a hallway lined with mirrored walls and whispers. People stared, some discreetly, some not. A black woman being escorted through executive corridors still had the power to make next turn. When they reached a waiting room, Winters broke the silence. He had you fired, didn't he? The question was casual, cruel. Happens all the time. Powerful men call, people like you lose their jobs. Diana raised an eyebrow. People like me? Winters straightened her glasses. Employees who don't know their place. Diana smiled, not with amusement, but with steel. And where exactly would that be? Before Winters could answer, her phone rang. He'll see you now. Richard Montgomery's office wasn't a room. It was a horizon. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto a Manhattan skyline so vast it made the city feel like a toy. He stood near the glass, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Diana entered slowly, not hesitating, not hurrying. Mr. Montgomery, Miss Johnson, he replied without turning. Thank you for coming, please sit. The silence that followed wasn't accidental, it was calculated. Diana knew this kind of silence. It was the kind designed to make people fill it with apologies, explanations, confessions. She let it stretch. Richard turned finally, his eyes sharp behind designer frames. Do you have a background? Excuse me? Education. Training, bachelor's in child development, NYU, incomplete master, S in special education. A flicker crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps. You work as a waitress. I work 3 jobs, the restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring when I can get students. He moved to his desk, picked up a folder. I did some research. After last night, I wanted to know who you were, the person who danced with my son. He opened the folder, photos. A community center, children dancing, Freedom Steps, you co-founded it, Diana nodded, with my sister, a program for children with mobility issues. He flipped to the next page. It's underfunded, nearly shutting down. Correct. Yet you didn't ask for money. No. Richard looked at her, measured her. Then he closed the folder and offered something that wasn't on paper. I want you to work for me as Lucas's therapeutic companion. He let the words settle before continuing. You'd have access to the best specialists, private facilities. I'll pay you 5 times your current income. I'll fund your master, help your sister if needed. He stopped, waited. Diana didn't answer right away. She looked past him out the window. The skyline stared back like a wall of mirrors. Then she met his eyes, calm, direct. No. Richard blinked. Excuse me. I don't work for people who see color and class before competence. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And I don't let people buy shortcuts to human connection. His jaw tightened. You're refusing an opportunity that could change your life. Possibly, she said, but I know what happens when you accept offers from men who see you as property. Eventually, they send someone like Miss Winters to remind you. He stared at her, long and hard, but something about her face made him hesitate. Diana stood. Lucas doesn't need another expert. He needs someone who sees him, who lets him lead. She paused at the door. You don't know your son, and you do. I know kids like him. Kids who have been told where they belong every day of their lives, just like me. And then, before he could answer, She reached into her purse and placed a card on his desk. Freedom Steps, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring him. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the card. First class is free. She turned and walked away. And for the first time in years, Richard Montgomery, master of mergers, king of control, realized he had just been outmaneuvered without ever being touched. The apartment in the Bronx wasn't much. 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with chipped tiles, and a living room that doubled as a workspace and a sanctuary. But it had warmth, the kind that came from shared struggle, whispered dreams, and quiet resilience. Diana sat on the faded couch, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea. Across from her, Zoe adjusted her hijab, balancing a folder full of lesson plans on her knee. Behind them, on the wall, hung a poster, Freedom Steps. The edges were curled, one corner was torn, but the message still held. Zoe broke the silence first. You really told him no? Diana nodded, sipping the tea. He offered 5 times my income, a full scholarship, help for you. And you said no? Yes. Are you insane? Zoe didn't mean it cruelly. It was exhaustion talking. They had spent months scraping rent together, watching funding applications disappear into silence. Diana didn't flinch. He doesn't see people, Zoe. He sees leverage. Zoe stared at her sister. You think refusing him will change that? Diana set the mug down. No, but it forces him to question what kind of man he is. There was a long pause, the kind only siblings could sit in without filling. Then Zoe leaned forward. Why him, Diana? Why now? Of all the billionaires in Manhattan, why this one? Diana reached for a manila folder on the table. She opened it slowly, revealing 3 neatly printed proposals, each one addressed to the Montgomery Foundation, each one stamped with a rejection. She didn't have to say it. Zoe already knew. He was the one who said no. 3 times, Diana added softly, without reading past the executive summary. I know, I checked the metadata. They were downloaded but never opened. Zoe leaned back, a low whistle escaping her lips. You knew who he was the moment he walked into that restaurant. Yes, and you danced with his son anyway. Diana's voice didn't waver. Because that boy, he looked at me like I was the only person in the room who hadn't already decided what he couldn't do. She turned toward the poster, and in that moment, I realized I didn't need Richard Montgomery's approval. I needed him to see, really see. So that card you gave him was not a courtesy, it was a challenge. Outside the window, a siren wailed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Life went on. Diana stood and walked to a cluttered shelf. She pulled down a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges, pages stuffed with annotations, sketches, and taped Polaroids of children mid-movement. She opened to a page marked with a red ribbon. Lucas's name had already been written. Below it, impulse initiation independent, social trust response high, left side brace compensates for core weakness, potential. Emotional recalibration through structured autonomy. Zoe walked over, reading over her shoulder. You already started a profile on him the moment he stood up. Zoe looked at her sister, not as the girl who once dropped out of grad school to take care of her, but as the woman who had built a methodology with nothing but willpower and a folding chair in a church basement. You're really going to make him come to us? Diana closed the notebook. If he wants to change his son's life, he'll have to leave his tower to do it. Zoe shook her head in disbelief. That's a gamble. No, Diana said quietly. That's a mirror. And as she turned off the light, the poster on the wall caught the last sliver of fading sun. The words below the logo glowed just enough to read. Every move counts. The Freedom Steps Center didn't look like much from the outside. A former warehouse on a quiet Bronx street, its brick walls bore the faded memory of a long-forgotten storage facility. But inside, the air pulsed with rhythm. Not perfection, not choreography, movement, raw, imperfect human movement. There were no chrome machines or white lab coats, just children, some in wheelchairs, some with braces, some without labels at all. Music played from a battered speaker in the corner, soft percussion, layered strings, enough to set the body in motion without demanding it obey. Lucas stood near the entrance, clutching the sleeve of his sweater. His braces clicked lightly with each nervous shift of weight. Diana crouched beside him, not speaking, just waiting. Finally, he whispered, "Is it okay if I just watch first?" She smiled. "Watching is part of learning. You can join when you're ready." Across the room, a girl in a motorized chair spun herself in slow, precise circles. A boy with a prosthetic leg attempted a hop, stumbled, then laughed, loud and free. Lucas's eyes widened. This wasn't therapy. This was something else. Richard stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a CEO surveying a chaotic startup. His suit jacket was gone, but his discomfort remained ironed into every inch of him. "This isn't a rehabilitation program," he muttered. "This is a circus." Zoe, standing beside him with a clipboard, offered a chair. "We prefer the term structured autonomy, but sure, take a seat." Richard didn't laugh. A door opened at the back of the studio. An older woman entered, leaning on a carved wooden cane. Her grey hair was braided into a crown, her presence quiet but commanding. Several children waved to her. She greeted them by name. Then her gaze landed on Richard. "Mr. Montgomery," she said with a small nod, "didn't expect to see you here." Richard straightened. "Dr. Mercer." His tone held surprise and a hint of wariness. "I thought you retired." "From Harvard." "Yes, but not from ideas." She gestured toward the children. "This is my latest research project." Richard blinked. "You're researching this?" "We're studying the effects of non-directive movement on neural reconfiguration in children with motor challenges." "This looks like a dance class." "Then you're not looking closely." Diana approached just as Richard opened his mouth to respond. She wore simple clothes with the program logo stitched by hand. "Welcome, Mr. Montgomery," she said, voice calm. "Lucas is welcome to join whenever he's ready." Richard gestured toward the scene before them. "This is what you invited us to, children spinning around unsupervised." Diana nodded. "Yes, and every movement you see is a data point. Every hesitation, every choice, evidence of motor autonomy in action." He folded his arms tighter. "Why would someone with your background work as a waitress? Because no one funded our program. Because proposals you rejected didn't just disappear into a folder. They had names, faces, children." Dr. Mercer stepped in. "Diana co-authored all 3 research proposals we submitted to the Montgomery Foundation." Richard turned, blinking. "She did. Incomplete degree, yes, but brilliant field methodology. We've published under her framework." Diana met his gaze without apology. "We knew who you were when you walked into Kingsley S. I recognized your son before you recognized yourself in him." Richard felt the ground shift, slowly, deliberately, like being maneuvered into a corner of his own making. "Was that dance staged?" "No," Diana said. Lucas stood up on his own. "I followed. That's the difference between support and control." Across the room, Lucas had begun to mimic a boy's arm movement, hesitant, then more confident. He still hadn't taken a step, but his body had begun to echo rhythm. A woman in jeans entered with a camera. Another held a clipboard. "We published preliminary results today," Dr. Mercer explained. "The press asked for a demonstration, so we invited them." Richard's jaw clenched. "You used my son for a PR stunt." Diana didn't back down. "We created a moment. You chose to walk into it." Zoe approached, holding a printed article. The headline read, "Revolutionary Motor Recovery Through Adaptive Movement." Beneath it, Diana's name, not assistant, not intern, author. Richard stared at the children again. For the first time, he didn't see chaos. He saw a language he didn't understand, but that his son did. And that terrified him more than anything. Because if Lucas was learning to speak without him, he had no choice but to listen. The studio was quieter than usual. Not silent, but softened. Midweek sessions tended to be smaller, more intimate. Outside, a steady breeze brushed through the cracked windows, and inside, the lights cast long, calm shadows across the old wooden floor. Children moved in clusters, some dancing freely, others seated, following the rhythm with small gestures of their hands or eyes. But in the center of the room, a different kind of stillness had taken root. Lucas stood alone. His usual brace clung to only one leg now. The other, removed minutes earlier, sat quietly on a nearby chair like a cast-off shell. Around him, the other children had instinctively drawn a circle close enough to witness, far enough not to interfere. They understood what this was, not performance, not therapy, something older, deeper. Diana noticed it first. She had been adjusting the volume on the speaker when her gaze locked on Lucas. She didn't move, she just watched. Her hand hovered near the dial and then let it fall. At the edge of the room, Richard Montgomery had risen from his seat. His instinct took over before his mind caught up. One step, then another. The tension in his jaw returned. He saw the brace on the floor, the tremble in Lucas's knees, the way his son's arms reached slightly outward, unsure whether to fall or fly, and he moved to intervene. Diana was there before he could take a third step. She didn't touch him. She didn't raise her voice. She only said 7 words. "This is his moment, not yours." Richard froze. Around them, a dozen journalists stood behind their quiet lenses. A camera clicked. Somewhere, a light blinked red. But the boy at the center of it all saw none of it. Lucas was focused only on the floor and the impossibly long distance between his feet and his future. He took a breath. 1, 2. His right leg shifted. His left wobbled in its unfamiliar freedom. And then, slowly, one foot moved forward. It wasn't clean, it wasn't strong, but it was his. A collective inhale passed through the room. For a second, it seemed no one dared blink. Then another click of a camera, and then the children began to clap, not in wild cheers, but in a soft, rhythmic affirmation, as if they all understood what that step cost and what it changed. Lucas turned his head. His face didn't show triumph. It showed something purer, concentration, ownership, a quiet kind of pride. Richard stared at his son, at the boy who had once lived in a fortress of medical schedules and expert forecasts, who had once needed help to stand. Now here he was, wobbling, yes, but standing on his terms. The press surged forward, questions flew, flashes ignited, but Diana gently raised her hand, guiding them back. "Let him breathe," she said. "Let him land." Dr. Mercer stepped beside Richard, her cane tapping gently against the floor. "This," she whispered, "is what we've been trying to show you." Richard said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. He walked slowly to the chair where the discarded brace sat, picked it up, held it in both hands like something sacred. He ran his thumb along its edge, then looked back at Lucas, who was now laughing softly with another boy. That laugh hurt more than it healed, because it meant Lucas had found joy without needing him to allow it. Later, in a quiet side room, Richard placed the brace on a table and sat down. Diana entered a moment later, not asking, not waiting. She looked at the brace. "He's not done needing it, but today he didn't want it." Richard's voice was low. "I thought progress was supposed to be measurable, charts, percentages. Timelines, sometimes," Diana said, "but not always. Sometimes it's just 1 foot forward before you're told to put it back." She paused. "Today he didn't ask." Richard nodded slowly, then looked up. "You made this happen." Diana met his eyes. "No, he did, I just didn't stop him." The silence between them stretched, this time not as a tactic, but a shared space. "He never smiled in those therapy rooms," Richard said quietly. "Not once." Diana tilted her head. "Because he wasn't moving toward anything. He was being pushed away from what scared everyone else." Outside the window, Lucas walked again, this time with a slight hop, mimicking another boy's move. They stumbled into laughter, fell onto the mat, got up, kept going. And Richard watched, for the first time, not as a man trying to fix his son, but as a father witnessing him come alive. The press conference was supposed to be simple: a few words, a few smiles, a photo op framed around the miracle of a boy taking one unsteady step. But nothing about this day had followed a script. Reporters crowded into the modest hallway outside the Freedom Step studio, mics in hand, cameras angled. The light was too harsh, the space too small. And Richard Montgomery stood in the center of it, just slightly off balance. "Mr. Montgomery," a voice called out from the left, sharp and fast, "is it true your foundation rejected this program 3 times? Another followed. "Why fund it now?" Then another. "Do you regret those rejections?" Richard inhaled slowly. Diana stood nearby but not beside him. She wasn't the kind to hover. She didn't need to. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was steady. "The Montgomery Foundation will be committing full funding to Freedom Steps for the next 5 years. We also intend to build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology you've witnessed today. There was a hum of surprise, clicks, flashes, but he wasn't finished. On one condition, he added, his gaze drifting to Diana, that Ms. Johnson retains complete academic autonomy, no corporate oversight, no interference. It landed like a stone in still water. Some eyebrows lifted, others didn't understand, but Diana did. She nodded once, acknowledging the gesture, not accepting it, not applauding it. A reporter turned to her. Ms. Johnson, do you have any comment? Diana looked at Richard, and then she said the thing no one expected. He still hasn't apologized. The room stiffened. Richard blinked, confused. Excuse me. You changed policies, she said evenly. You redirected resources. You gave us a platform, but you never looked me in the eye and said, I was wrong. The silence that followed was heavier than any question. It wasn't an attack. It was an invitation to confront something deeper than PR strategy. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. The cameras captured him in a rare, unscripted moment, not powerful, not polished, human, vulnerable. And then, from behind the row of reporters, a small voice broke the silence. Dad. Lucas stepped forward, standing just beyond the tape line. His eyes were wide, not afraid, just curious. Are you doing this for me or for her? It wasn't accusation, it was inquiry, honest, direct, and it pierced through Richard like no journalist ever could. He looked at his son, then at Diana, and he realized he didn't know how to answer, not fully. He crouched beside Lucas, ignoring the flashes, ignoring the microphones. I'm doing this, he said slowly, because someone showed me a better way, and because you deserve more than I was giving. Lucas didn't say anything, but he nodded just once. The press didn't cheer. There were no claps, just the quiet hum of recorders running, because something unspoken had shifted, not just policy, not just money, ownership. As the crowd began to disperse, Diana turned to leave. Richard reached for words again, but none came, because he was beginning to understand. An apology isn't about saying sorry. It's about recognizing the space you took up and learning how to step aside. The new Freedom Step Center didn't shimmer with steel and glass. It wasn't polished like the towers downtown, nor did it boast a grand marble lobby. Instead, its walls were painted in soft blues and sunlit yellows. The floors were scuffed from sneakers and wheels. Paper butterflies hung from the ceiling, and hand-drawn signs marked each room with names like Courage Hall and the Balance Room. The logo above the entrance, bold letters curved around a dancing figure, had been designed by a child. Lucas, in fact. His initials were quietly tucked into the corner of the sign. 6 months had passed since that step, not a giant leap. Just one shaky foot forward. But in those 6 months, everything had moved. The ceremony was already in motion. Families filled folding chairs set up in rows. Children laughed. Music played, not orchestral, not rehearsed. Just sound that moved with them, not ahead of them. In the center of the hall, a group of kids gathered. Lucas among them, no brace on his right leg today, just a soft compression sleeve and a quiet confidence that had taken root where hesitation once lived. They didn't perform a routine. Not really. There were no counts, no commands, but the group swayed, stepped, paused, together, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Lucas led a spin. Another girl followed with a slow hop. A boy in a chair moved his arms like wings. It was messy, beautifully so. From the back of the room, Richard Montgomery sat without a tie. His suit jacket was folded over his lap. He didn't hold a microphone. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He simply watched. Next to him, Diana stood quietly, clipboard in hand. She hadn't spoken much all morning. Her eyes were everywhere, checking safety mats, counting heads, noting which child had arrived late or skipped lunch. But when Lucas stepped forward alone, arms wide in a motion of open invitation, she stopped moving. He wasn't perfect. His left foot dragged slightly, his balance wobbled, but he didn't look for permission. He didn't look to the sidelines, he just kept going. A reporter approached Richard near the end of the routine. Softly, politely, "Mr. Montgomery, may I ask, how does it feel to see your son like this?" Richard didn't answer right away. He watched as Lucas reached out to help a smaller boy find his center. Not carry him, just steady him, guide without leading. Then Richard spoke, quietly but clearly, proud. Not of what he's overcome, but of what he's creating for others. The reporter nodded, ready to move on, but paused. And what's been the biggest lesson for you, sir? Richard looked at the children again, then at Diana, then back to Lucas. He let the silence linger, let the weight of it settle. Then he said that not all great leaders know the path forward. Some of them have to be shown it, and the best among them are the ones willing to follow. The words didn't echo, they landed. And Diana, from the side, allowed herself the smallest smile. Later, as families milled about the new classrooms, Richard walked the halls. He didn't speak much, just observed, noted the murals, the children's art, the open doors. He passed a room labeled The First Step. Inside was a photo, Lucas, mid-motion, 1 foot lifted, unsure. Underneath it, not about perfection, about permission. Diana joined him near the exit. He doesn't need you to hold him anymore, she said. No, Richard replied, but he still needs me to be around. She looked at him, measured him. That's a crucial difference. He nodded, then softer, thank you. For what? She asked. For teaching me to follow. Outside, the sun touched the logo one last time. The initials in the corner, LM, caught the light just enough for Richard to notice. And for once, he didn't try to claim the moment. He simply let it pass and followed. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.